Hi everyone. My name is Michael, and I'm one of the MDplus Data Science and AI co-directors. And today we're going to be doing a quick overview of some of the basics of Python. Definitely not all-encompassing, but kind of specifically focusing on kind of aspects of Python that might be helpful as you're trying to access the different data sets as part of the Datathon, and also potentially using generative AI and in particular large language models for your different projects. So as you can hopefully see on my screen right now, I'm currently in the MDplus Slack channel, and you guys should all be part of this Datathon 2024 Slack channel. If you guys don't have access to this, please let me know. So I'm currently under the logistics tab, which you guys again all have access to. And this just kind of contains a lot of helpful info that hopefully will be of use like throughout the Datathon. But the one we're going to specifically focus on today is this tutorial notebook that we've prepared. So I'm going to copy this link, and then I'm going to open it up in my web browser, which will take just a few seconds to load, hopefully. And as you can see, it takes us to this kind of interface here, right? This may or may not be kind of what you guys are already familiar with when we think about Python, but I think this will be a very helpful tool for kind of throughout the Datathon and Python programming in general. So we're using a platform called Google Colab. So it's Colab, but with one L. And basically, it's a platform that allows you to write not only Python code, but also like helpful like information about your code and things like that that make it kind of like an interactive, almost like sort of notebook that people can use to understand your code and also run it at the same time. And so for that reason, anytime you see like this file called like IPYNB, um, it indicates basically what we call like a Python or a Jupyter notebook is sometimes what you'll see on the internet. So this is an example of that. So you can see this text here, right? If I double click on this, this is something called Markdown, which is not that important. But this contains not code, but rather just explanatory information for you, the reader, to be able to know kind of like what this notebook is about, right? So we know that this is some Python code / notebook that relates to the 2024 MDplus Datathon, some stuff here, right? And then, as I said earlier, right, the whole point of this tutorial is that we're going to just go over kind of the basics of Python. Again, Python is a very, it has a lot of different features, and there's no way for us to cover all of it in one session, but hopefully we can cover at least some of the relevant parts. Okay. So again, for those of you who may not have used it before, Python was built originally to be a kind of a general purpose, very easy to pick up, user-friendly programming language that's kind of become like the de facto standard that people use for anything related to artificial intelligence. So if you guys ever want to do anything in like machine learning or AI, usually you'll almost always be using Python. There are obviously some exceptions to that, but I think it covers like 95% of the use cases you'll see. And so it's easy to kind of like read and write Python code, or at least that's how it was built. But building a lot of these things from scratch, like things that we want to do with Python, right? So things like how do we download a data set? How do we load it onto our computer? How do we manipulate it? All of that stuff, right? A lot of those things you don't want to be like coding from scratch, because you can imagine that would be extremely painful. What we want you guys to focus on is just doing the interesting stuff that you actually want to explore for the Datathon, right? And so Python is basically built upon these things called packages, where really smart and experienced programmers in the Python community, they've already written a lot of like helpful tools and functions and things like that for us, right, the Datathon participants, to be able to use for tasks like, for example, loading data sets and using large language models and all that stuff, right? And so we can use basically we need to specify to Python that there are specific packages that we want to use. And the way that we do that is using a Python package manager called pip. Okay, so pip, to make it maybe a little bit more clear, is like pip is not a like Python command or a piece of Python code or whatever. It's specifically like a package manager that tells your computer to download and potentially make available some packages that you might want to use, right? So here we can see, okay, we want pip, which is something that basically said we want to install Python packages, right? We want to install Python packages. And what packages do we want to install? We want to install a package called Datasets, IPy widgets together. And this is like a flag that basically tells us that we want to install it quietly, which means like I'm going to suppress sort of like the outputs that we get. Okay. So for this tutorial, these are the only three, I guess, like packages that we need. Obviously, for your specific applications, you might want to use other packages. And you might be wondering, okay, what do these packages do? And we'll see that very shortly. Okay. So I'm going to run this, right? So you can see here, right? This is a code block, which is different from kind of like the above, right? Which is like text. The way we know that this is a code block is because you can see like this little run arrow here, right? One way to run the cell is to just, press this play button, right? I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift Enter, okay? As you can see in the comment here, right? And so what that's doing is that you can see it's starting up kind of like this, like compute environment, right? And now it's running this command. You can see it's doing some stuff. It's installing all of these packages for us. So that way we can use it in some of our subsequent code. Okay, so yeah, so as you can see here, right, the check mark means it's done executing, and now we have these packages available to us. Okay, just because we have those packages available doesn't mean that Python knows that we're going to use them yet, and the distinction there is a little bit sometimes hard to understand at first, but basically you'll see, oftentimes people will do like you install the packages you want to use. And then you actually need to like import them into Python. So that way Python knows, hey, we're actually going to be using functions from these different packages that we have here. Okay. So for example, here you can see datasets, right? Is a package that we just installed, and I'm going to import that package. And what that means is that all of the helpful utility tools and functions that have been included in this package are now available to me for me to be able to use in my own code, right? So you can see IPy widgets, right? Maybe it's kind of similar here, right? Maybe this line is from IPy widgets. Maybe you can say, okay, this together thing is from this together package, right? But some of these you can see are not from, we didn't install these, right? So you might be wondering, okay, how can we just import this kind of like OS package or this request package, right? So it turns out like some of these packages are like not required to be like installed, I guess, because they come automatically with Python. And so we don't need to like download and, make sure that we have these packages available because they already are natively available in Python. And all we need to do is just specify that, hey, we want to be using these packages that you already have available in Python. Okay. I think being able to know what packages you may or may not need is hard. It's a hard thing to be able to do, especially if you're coding for the first time. And so I think a lot of this is really you kind of learn on the fly, right? Like I'll give you an example. Like as I'm kind of putting together this, tutorial to be able to share with you guys, right? I don't know exactly what packages I'll need, right? I didn't know that I'll need the request package or whatever, right? It's more like, you kind of fill this as you're kind of doing your project by figuring out, okay, what do I want to do? Like with my code, right? I'll Google that specific use case. And if the answer that people say on like, oh, how do you do that thing that you want to do involves a certain package, well, then you have to install that package, right? That's usually like the typical workflow. You wouldn't like know beforehand that you would like need these packages, if that makes sense. So just because I have these at the beginning, it's more of like a priori thing that I know we need these. If you're coding for the first time or coding from scratch, you might not have anything here, and that's totally fine, right? You add these on a per need, like per use space case. Okay. This line, don't worry about, doesn't really mean anything here. So again, we need to run this code block, and what that's telling the computer, right? What that's telling Python is that, hey, we want to use all of these different packages. Maybe from these specific packages, we want to import specific utility functions and specific, tools and stuff like that. Okay. Now, as we mentioned at the kickoff event, we have three different tracks, right? One in medical education, one in clinical documentation, and one in mental health. And all of these surround this idea of generative AI, right? And because we have these three different tracks, we've also made three different data sets available to you guys, right? So let's explore kind of like what those data sets might look like, okay? So here we're declaring something called a dictionary, okay? So a dictionary is anytime you see these kind of like curly black brackets here, um, it can actually mean a couple different things, but for us, usually it will mean that we're dealing with a dictionary. And all a dictionary is basically a mapping from a key to a value, right? So you can imagine like your phone book, right, on your iPhone or phone or whatever, right, is kind of like a dictionary, right? So you can think of it as a mapping of people's names, right, to their phone numbers, right? So you have a mapping of someone's name to a phone number, and that's all a dictionary is, okay? So the people's names are what we call keys, and their phone numbers are what we call values, right? So a dictionary maps keys to values. Okay, so here you can see that we've constructed a dictionary. We've named that dictionary this variable called track options. Um, and the keys are these strings here that are like medical education. That's a string, right? Clinical documentation. These are different tracks, right? And then these are the values associated with it, right? So in this case, this is like the unique identifier, like the name of the data set that we'll be importing from kind of Hugging Face, which is, again, don't Hugging Face is not super important right now. So basically what this does is it's a mapping of like names of the different tracks of our Datathon to kind of like their IDs, if you think about it. Okay, so we have track options, right? And what we're doing here is, okay, we're getting a list of all of the keys, right? So the keys again are these ones, right? So the keys map to the colon means maps to values, right? So we're getting a list of all the keys here, medical education, clinical documentation, mental health. And this index here, right, this bracket means we're taking the 0th element of the list of keys. Okay, so you can see that these parentheses here, right? All we're doing is making this keys into a list, right? And then this bracket here is telling us that we're taking the 0th element of the list. Okay, so Python has this weird thing where everything is zero indexed. Okay, so zero indexing means that the first element, what you would call like the first element, is actually referred to in Python as the 0th element. Okay, so let's say we have a list of three keys to values here, right? Or a dictionary of three key value pairs, right? So this would be the 0th key, the first key, and the second key. Okay, it's just like this random quirk from that most programming languages use to be what we call zero indexed instead of one indexed. And what that means is that the first element is actually the 0th element instead of like the first element. Okay, so all this is doing is saying, hey, we're going to store track, which is a variable, and this variable is going to store like ultimately our like the track that we're actually going to be doing, right? But just as a default, it's going to take the first, or I guess the 0th, right, key of the track options, right? And this is going to be like our default track, right? So basically, this just sets track equal to medical education. Okay. Knowing that, for example, these square brackets means that we're taking the 0th element, right, of the track, right? That's certainly not intuitive if this is your first time programming, right? And so, knowing this notation and stuff, right? A lot of this is just kind of like learning on the fly, right? Oftentimes, I think people find programming to be kind of, oh, like this doesn't make any sense, and why is it square brackets here, and curly braces mean something else, and parentheses mean something else, right? Like this all feels like very overwhelming, right? But this is really how everyone learns programming. Like the people that like the way I started, right, is really just looking over what other people wrote and just writing it myself. And you're going to get a lot of errors and you're going to get a lot of bugs and you're going to not have like no idea what's happening. But that's kind of like the whole point of this, right? To be able to have an environment where you can just kind of freely try stuff and experiment with things and have things fail. And you have like multiple discussion boards where you're able to ask for help and ask for what people like what their thoughts are and things like that. Okay. So I understand like this, even just these two lines of code can be very overwhelming, and that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of how I started out as well. Um, but just kind of looking at it and writing it yourself and writing things that are similar to it, that's kind of like how you learn. Okay. So same thing here, right? Now we have this new variable track selection, right? Um, widgets dot drop down. What does that mean? How do we know how to write that, right? So I can tell you just for your purposes, truly widgets is just something that I'm using to like make your life a little bit easier. But like most of you will not need to use this package, so I'm not too worried about it. But basically, the syntax here, right? This dot means we're taking a kind of like a function from widgets, right? So widgets is what we imported here, right, from the IPyWidgets package. So we're taking, in this case, it's something called a class, which is a little bit different than a function. The distinction here is not super important. But basically, this is something that we're pulling from the widgets package, right? Just like keys is something that we're pulling from track options, the dictionary, right? Anytime you see a dot, it kind of means like we're pulling something from like something else, okay? So we're in this case creating a drop-down menu, right? Like creating a drop-down object with specific arguments, right? So these are function arguments, right? So I want to set the options of the drop-down equal to, track options.keys, which we said earlier, which is just the keys of this dictionary, right? What's the description of this dropdown? This string track, and the value is, I just set equal to track. Okay. Now, how do I know that these are like the inputs to this function? This is something that's related to like documentation, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay. But for now, you can just imagine, right? This is a function that I'm calling from the widgets package, and these are the arguments of the function. And for our purposes, this is just creating a drop-down menu for us that we're going to see what that looks like later. And we're calling that drop-down menu this new variable called track selection. Okay. As a side note, right? Variable names, generally speaking, you kind of name it whatever you want, but there are certain restrictions, right? So for instance, you can't include a space like that, like Python will complain like, hey, like this looks like two different variables. Like, what are you doing here, right? You can't do that. You can't use hyphens. You can't use plus signs, equal signs. So anytime you want a space, you usually just do an underscore. And then the other big rule is that you can't start with like a digit. Okay, so this is invalid. I think this is also invalid. Yeah, this is invalid. So in general, just start with a letter. You can make it uppercase, lowercase, it doesn't really matter. Okay. And another just kind of rule of thumb, right? Try to name variables kind of helpful names, right? Like if I call this variable B, like that's kind of useless for you, right? If you're kind of reading this code for the first time, you've never seen this code before, and I just call it B, you have no idea what this is, right? If I call it track selection, right, then maybe you're able to deduce, right, that, oh, okay, this is a drop-down menu to help us select the dataset track or the Datathon track that we're participating in, right? So just name your variables helpful stuff, right? What's intuitive for you may not always be intuitive for other people. Okay. This is a helper function. What this is exactly doing truly does not matter for this, right? But I think it is worth noting kind of like what a function is because it's kind of like the first time we've seen it, right? So functions essentially are things that take in inputs and return some output that we want. Okay, so you can imagine we might have a function square, right? Where it takes in a number and it squares it. So maybe I give it an input of 2, it gives me 4. If I give it an input of 3, it gives me 9, right? So a function is just anything that maps an input to an output, right? And we said some of these packages, they have helpful functions for us, but sometimes you want to define your own function, right? So for example, this function here, right? The way that we're defining a function, we say def, we're defining a function. But what's the function's name? It's going to be onChange. And this onChange function takes in exactly one variable, okay? Um, I personally like doing something called type hinting, which is not required by Python by any means. And we'll talk about how to like modify this to something that's probably a little bit easier. But basically, it's a variable called change. It's a single input, right? And then it's going to return basically nothing. Okay, so this is this none thing. Okay. I mentioned this thing called type hinting. So it's not like type hinting is something that's not necessary in Python, but let me show you kind of what that means. Okay, so an equally valid function is if I just write this. Okay, so I'm defining a function called onChange. It has one, it takes in one input, and we're calling that input change, and it's going to return something. Okay, this colon is necessary just to say like, hey, we're defining the function, and now here's whatever comes next. That's the definition of the function. Okay. Um, Now you can see here, right? Uh, I don't really know what change is supposed to be if I'm looking at this at the first time, right? Is change a number? Is change a string? Or like what is change, right? I also have no idea what I'm supposed to expect, right? On like what this function is supposed to return, right? Now this is a totally valid function in Python, right? But if you've like, you know, especially if you're sharing code with others, right? You want to make sure your code is as legible as possible. Um, this will look kind of like really weird for a lot of people, right? And I have no idea how to interpret this. And so that's why personally, I really like adding type hinting, right? So this colon says, okay, we have a input, and this colon says, okay, this input is specifically, we're expecting it to be a dictionary that maps key values that are type string into anything, essentially, is what it's saying. Okay. So change should be a dictionary of keys to values. That's all I'm saying here. Okay. And what do we expect from the return, right? What should this function return? Well, we expect that it shouldn't return anything at all, right? And so now, because I've added these input and output type hints, right? Now you, who has never seen my code before and you're reading it for the first time, kind of know, oh, okay, now we have a new function called onChange, and I expect this type of input and I expect this type of output, right? Um, so that's type hinting. Again, totally not necessary. You don't need to do it. Python will still run perfectly fine. It doesn't change anything other than purely the legibility. Okay. Um, if you're interested in learning more about type hinting, just let me know. But yeah, so we have a function here, right? The global stuff, don't worry about too much. But what we're saying here, right, is that if this change, right, this change dictionary, the input, right, if the type of the change is like just it's equal to change, right, and the name of the change is equal to the value, then we're changing the track, okay, the track variable up here, okay. If statements are good to know, right, that's something called a conditional, right? So if some condition we want to be true, right? So if a number is greater than two, then I want to double it. Or if a number times three is less than two or something, right? So if you want to do something conditioned on a fact that something else is true, if statements are really helpful. And this is something you can Google, okay? And basically so this is just a condition that I want to be true. If this is true, then, right, this colon says, then I want to modify the track variable, okay? Again, exactly what this function does, I'm just telling you is truly not that important. It's just to make this look pretty for the demo, okay? Again here, right, so we're saying, okay, this track selection variable, right, this drop down widget menu, right, we're saying, okay, we're calling the observe function of this drop down menu, and we're telling it to observe like onChange, which is a variable, which is a function here, right? Again, don't worry about what this does, okay? And now we're gonna display our widget, okay? So I'm gonna run this code, right? And then now you can see, hopefully this little widget pops up, this drop down menu that we've created, right? And so let's say if you want to do medical education track, like that's basically it. You don't need to do anything, right? But if you're doing a different track, you can just select your track here, and that's all you have to do to kind of change it, okay? So just for simplicity, I'm gonna do, I guess, the medical education track. And then we'll kind of go from there. Okay. I'm going to take a short aside here and kind of walk through, okay, how do I know these were the inputs to our function, right? How did I know that this observe function exists? Okay, how do I know that this display function exists? Okay, so this is something called like documentation, and I think it takes a little bit of time to be able to learn like how to read all of that stuff. But basically, there's a bajillion different types of functions out there, a bit for each of these different packages, right? And so it's worth knowing kind of like how do we like so basically documentation tells us what do these different functions do, what are the different functions, and what are the expected inputs and outputs and things like that, right? So let's take a look at this widget stuff, right? So I see, for instance, okay, IPy widgets, we imported widgets, right? So let's just look up IPy widgets documentation. So usually you can just look up package documentation. Okay. Read the docs is usually kind of what you'll see. Sometimes they have different names and stuff, but usually it's like on the first page, right? So read the docs here, right? And usually you'll see something like this, right? So I can see so I guess this is Jupyter widgets, right? This is the IPy widgets package. And this is kind of like just, it gives you all of like the documentation stuff, right? So for example, maybe we're interested in like, okay, what does this drop-down widget do, right? So I'll look up, okay, I want to create a drop-down menu, right? So you can see here, right? And it'll show me to, where is it? Drop-down, right? So it says, okay, widgets drop-down, and then these are the different options, right? So these are the different arguments, right? And then they have, I guess, in this case, it's quite nice. They actually do have an example of this, right? They can see how that works. And you can see like the different arguments as well, right? Which is really cool. So that basically tells you kind of like how to use these functions, right? Another common package that I'm sure you guys will come across is something called pandas. So pandas documentation. Okay, so we're looking at the documentation here. Again, so this one's not read the docs, right? Something else, right? But pandas is a package in Python that's used to basically manipulate and load and analyze tabular data. So things with like rows and columns and stuff like that. And you can see here, right? So they have different options here. If you have never used pandas before, you can kind of like, like follow this short 10-minute tutorial, right? We can also get the API reference. So API is basically like all of these functions that they offer. And they offer a lot of different functions, right? So let's go to, maybe I want to load I'm trying to see like what would be helpful here. Let's load a Excel file, right? So they have a helpful function. Okay, read Excel, right? Or maybe we want to save something to an Excel file, right? So we have some data frame, right, which is a Python, is a pandas object. I encourage you guys to look at the documentation for that. And we have this function to Excel, and all of these are the different inputs, and it describes what the function does, what the inputs to this function are, right? And also like these type hints that I talked about, right? Also potentially maybe you're not looking for Excel, right? Maybe you're looking how to save it to a CSV, or I don't even know what this is, right? Or maybe you want to read an Excel file instead. So they usually have like helpful suggestions here as well. And then they have examples as well. So long story short, right? This is just a very long way of saying that documentation is your best friend. If you don't know what a function does, how to use a function, you have to be able to find it through the documentation, because like that's kind of like the requirement of documentation. Otherwise, it's a very poor package. Yeah. And if you have trouble finding stuff, again, please feel free to like ask a question or contact us or anything. Okay. Okay, let's go back to this, right? So we kind of walked through kind of like this code block here. We walk through all of like these different variables, what they do, and now we have this little widget here that allows us to basically select which track we're doing, right? So, and we said, let's stick with the medical education track. If you guys are doing a different one, then just select whatever track you're doing. Okay. And then now all you have to do is basically just run this code block. Okay. Basically what this is doing is that whatever track you selected, it's now going to load the data set from the MDplus Datathon 2024 kind of dataset repository, and we're specifically loading the data specific to your track. Okay. Again, how do we know that this load dataset exists? Well, we look at the datasets package, right? Datasets package documentation. I'm not going to do that, but you can imagine, that's kind of how you would know that this function exists, right? We're going to load this dataset, and it's going to return a dataset object, and we're calling that dataset this new variable ds for dataset. Okay. And then we've already done the hard part of partitioning all of these datasets into training and test datasets. And so I've just called them train dataset and test dataset. These are the two variables that correspond to the training pandas table and the test pandas table. Okay, so I'm going to run this. There's nothing you need to change here. Again, we get this warning about the Hugging Face token. Don't worry about that for now. And you can see, okay, we get this check mark. Everything's good. And now we have these two variables, train dataset and test dataset, that we might want to use. Okay. So what does this actually look like, right? Let's just print it out, right? So if you just put a variable in a code block, right, and just press Shift Enter or just this button here, right, you can actually just see what the data looks like. And you can see we have, again, tabular data, right? That's what this like two pandas function does. It converts into a pandas table, which is basically rows which correspond to individual kind of like data points, if you can, kind of like data points, right? And then columns which correspond to the different kind of like variables that we care about. Okay, so in this medical education data set, right, we have over, what was it, 10,178 different questions, right? And you can see these are the questions, right? And then I guess these are the answer to the question probably, right? Maybe the different options for the multiple choice question that this corresponds to. So meta info, so I'm guessing this probably corresponds to, this is a USMLE step 2 or 3 question. And then the answer index, which is probably like, okay, nitrofurantoin was answer E in this options dictionary. Okay. So again, rows, different data points, and then columns are the different like features or attributes that you care about, right? Let's say I want to look at a specific column, like, okay, what are we sure that this is a question, right? So what you can do is just do question, right? And you can see, okay, just the questions, right? Maybe I want to see specifically like the 0th question, right? We said that Python is 0 indexed. Python has this very strange thing. Pandas has this very strange thing where if you just do this, it actually does work. Okay. Well, sometimes this won't work, depending on your kind of use case and also the version of pandas that you have and stuff. So usually I like to just do, if you're getting a row, this iloc is, you're getting a row, and which row are you getting? You're getting the 0th row. Okay, so again, this is just a quirk that I happen to know because I work with a lot of panda stuff. How would you know that this exists, right? Well, you would just try this, right? Like what everything is intuitive, and then if it fails, right, then you go to Google, you type, how do I get the 0th row of a pandas table, and it'll tell you to use iloc. Okay. Okay, so, and this is what it looks like. It's a string, right? This is the actual value of the string, right? And so we can see this kind of looks like a USMLE question, right? So you can read it if you want, but that's kind of what it looks like. Okay. Okay, so we talked about what this data set is, right? So now we have the ability to work with, manipulate. You can do a lot of things with this. You can partition it. You can introduce new attributes, new columns here, right? So there's a lot of things you can do with these data sets, right? One of these things that you can do with this data set, with any of these data sets, right, is feed it into an LLM, right? So probably what you guys are familiar with, right, is let's go back to this single question here, right? Let's say you were studying for your USMLE, right? And this question came up as one of your study questions, and you're like, oh God, I have no idea how to answer this. I don't even know how to approach it. I might go to ChatGPT, right, and just paste this question in, right? And ChatGPT will give me an answer, and I'm like, oh, okay, cool, I understand it better, right? So this is what we call like querying, right? So my pronunciation is not great, but like querying, like an LLM, right? Or in this case, ChatGPT, right? Um, and this is great if you just have one question, right? Like in this case, right? Um, but the problem though, right, is that in this case, right, you have like literally like 10,000 different questions, right? I don't think any of you want to individually copy paste all of these questions, ask it to ChatGPT, and like figure out stuff that way, right? Like I think that's a horrible use of your time, right? Instead, what you might want to do is programmatically ask ChatGPT questions so that you can rapidly get, kind of responses sort of in real time using code, right? And so you can imagine there's a lot of really interesting stuff that you can do here, right? You can, given this data set, you can see if I ask ChatGPT all of these questions, what is its average accuracy, or how biased is it, right? Or how often does it get the wrong answer, and why does it get the wrong answer? Can it explain why it does that? And the only way to kind of actually evaluate these questions at a scale of like literally thousands of questions is to be able to ask ChatGPT questions not from kind of, chatgpt.com, but rather through code. And that's what we're going to kind of focus on next. Okay. So, okay, to kind of recap, right, we have this training data set here, right? And we want to use code to be able to interact with this data set using large language models. Okay, that's kind of like this next step here. So yeah, there are multiple different types of language models out there. Okay, obviously, I think everyone at this point is familiar with ChatGPT, but there's other ones as well. Okay, and for the purposes, you can see a kind of like big font here, right? For the purposes of the Datathon, we're making it very explicit that you can only use open source models with no more than 8 billion parameters. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. What does this mean, right? Open source models means that whoever developed the model, right, like Facebook or Google or OpenAI or whatever, right, has decided to make all of the language model itself, they've just given it to the public freely, right? Anyone can download it, anyone can use it on their own computer. Um, it's kind of free for everyone to use, right? So models like ChatGPT do not fall under open source. Okay. ChatGPT is basically like no one knows how big is it or how it actually works. Only the people at OpenAI, the engineers that actually developed it, actually know how it works. And every time we ask ChatGPT a question, we have to send it up to, we have to ask the question to OpenAI. OpenAI asks their own internal proprietary private ChatGPT model, hey, can you answer this question? ChatGPT returns a response, and only and OpenAI then returns the response to you, right? We have no way of using ChatGPT on our own computers, like without going through this OpenAI platform, right? Um, and other models, I think the two big ones are ChatGPT and something called Claude from Anthropic. Those two are specifically you cannot use for the Datathon. If you're going to use anything with language models, you don't have to, right? So that's what open source means. Okay, and we'll go over some options for open source models. Now, a separate way that we classify language models is based on how big they are, right? We classify how big a model is based on how many parameters, how many neurons does this model have, right? And you can kind of imagine as like the more neurons you have, the bigger your brain is, kind of, right? So different LLMs have different sizes, right? So some LLMs have 1 billion parameters, right? Some LLMs have 400 billion parameters. ChatGPT has an unknown number, although it's probably a lot bigger than that. And basically, generally speaking, if you have bigger LLMs with more parameters, generally you get better performance. Okay. What that also means is that it takes a lot longer to train. It's usually more expensive to use. And so for that reason, we're we're specifically restricting everyone to only use models with that are no bigger than 8 billion. So if you're using an 8 billion model, that's totally fine, but 9 billion is not okay. Okay. So again, we'll go over the different models that kind of fit this criteria. If you have a question on whether a model would fit this criteria or not, just let us know. But for this demo specifically, we're going to use a kind of a state-of-the-art model that falls under this criteria, right? It's a language model from Meta. It's called Llama 3.1. Okay. And again, what this means is that it's a less than 8 billion parameter model that Meta, like Facebook, has decided to release publicly so that everyone can use it by themselves. You don't need to go through Meta to be able to ask the LLM questions. You can just run it on your own computer. It's like any other piece of software. Okay. Um, Now, okay, still 8 billion parameters, it's still a pretty big model, right? And so asking all of you guys to download such a huge file, right, of parameters and running on your computer, I'm pretty sure half of your computers would blow up, okay? And so instead of doing that, right, there are certain platforms out there, such as Together AI. Um, sorry, I just realized there's a typo. But basically, Together AI, is a platform that has allowed you to like ask it questions, right? Like through like ask like this Llama 3.1 question a question, right? And then it'll do the computations on its own computer, right? So essentially what you're doing is you don't need to do the computations yourself. Together AI's computers will do it for you, but it costs a little bit of money. Okay. Um, we'll walk through kind of like what that means and how much money it is and stuff. Because I know once money is involved, people get kind of understandably very scared about that and what that means, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to Together AI, right? So this is what the web page looks like. It's I think a fairly recently developed company, and you can click Get Started on the upper right hand corner here, right? So I think I already have an account, so I'm going to sign in with my GitHub. But you can sign in however you want, right? So you can see this is my page, right? Um, so once you've created an account, once you've signed in, right, you're going to create an API key, right? And this API key is basically a unique way, right? It's like a string that says, "Hey, this is me." And anytime you ask it together like a question, right, you provide the API key, and that way Together knows, "Oh, hey, okay, it's you that asked the question, so I'm going to build your account." Okay. So just click on this, right? Click on this link. Create an API key. It should look like a random string of random digits. Doesn't really look like anything, right? But it's important. Okay, so this is treat it as your social security card. Okay, you never ever share your API key with anyone. If I or Lawrence or Emily or anyone on the MDplus team asks you for the API key, that means like it's a scam or something. Okay, like never ever share your API key with anyone. Okay. Um, so then, okay, once you have your API key, right, you can create in Google Colab, you can create a secret, and you click on I think this button here, or sorry, this button here, secrets, right, and then you add your API key to you name it Together API key, you paste the value, and then now only your notebook and only you have access to that key. Okay. I'm not going to walk through that demo here because I already have my API keys shared here. And if I click on secrets, I'm afraid it's going to show you all of you my API key, which would be really bad, right? Because I'm basically just telling you guys my social security number. So I'm not going to do that. But if you have any trouble with these two steps, please let me know. Okay. So kind of a lot of yapping at this point, right? But like the whole idea, right, is that we want to run inference with a language model. We don't want to do it on our own computer, so we're going to use this platform instead called Together AI. Okay. So this basically says I'm going to set the environmental variable as this, kind of our secret that we just set. Okay. And if everything goes well and you do all these steps, then you should be able to do this just fine. And in this case, I already put my API key in, so I'm totally fine. Okay. So now to log into Together AI, right, we're going to create a LLM client. And the way that we do that is using this together function, right, that we, again, if I scroll all the way up, we import it from this together package. Okay. Okay, so we're going to create this LLM client. We're good, right? And okay, cool. So now we have now we're actually doing like the actual inference step, right? We're going to ask our LLM our question, right? So here, this is just some code that says, again, so remember if is like this like conditional statement. If our track that we're doing, our Datathon track is medical education, then the actual input, right, that we want to give to the LLM is like this question column here. Okay. And so that's what we're saying here. Then the input column name is question. Elif basically in Python means else if. So if this is true, then set this, right? Otherwise, right, if this is not true, right, and if your track is clinical documentation, then you want your column name to be dialogue. So if, dialogue is the column of the inputs that you might want to use for the clinical documentation track, right? And otherwise, right, if both of these conditions are not true, else the column name should be text. And basically the only other case could be track is mental health, and in this case, the mental health track is the input is text. Okay. Okay. Let's take a look at what this sample input looks like. Right. So if I run this, sample input is just so you can see this ilog function, right? The training data set, I guess the 0th row, and what is the question, right? And you can see this is the question, 23-year-old pregnant woman. This is the exact question that we showed earlier. Okay. So we've saved the input, right? Right. This is a question, I guess a USMLE question in this case. And we've saved it as some variable called sample input. And we want to ask the LLM this question, right? We want to give this LLM this input prompt, and we want to get some response out. Okay. So that's what this next block does, right? I'm explicitly warning you here. If you run this block, it does cost a few cents. So you should look at the pricing page. There's a Together AI pricing page here, right? That tells you how much does like how much do each of these different models cost. So here we're using Llama 3.1, right? If we're using the text 8 billion model, I think in this case, right, then it costs, so it looks like price per 1 million tokens is 18 cents, okay? Tokens so I think it's like 1,000 tokens is like 750 words, or 750 tokens is like 1,000 words. So I would look up that conversion. If you're not sure about that, please let us know. But roughly speaking, right, let's say, 1,000 words cost 18 cents to run. Okay. So if I have an input here, right, if I want to estimate the cost, right, maybe this is like 300 words, right? So maybe this is like 6 cents to run. Okay. So it's important to be conscious about this, right? If we don't want anyone like seriously digging into their bank account, so it's something that you like should be monitoring. There are ways to like circumvent this problem, right? You could use smaller models and just run it on your own computer, right? That's free, and you can 100% do that. You could, there are free credits, right? So you get $5 free API credits. You could like technically sign up for multiple accounts if you burn through this $5, but truly, I think this $5 should be enough to get through initial experimentation. And if finances really become an issue and you've kind of exhausted a lot of different strategies, please let us know. We're a student-run group, but we'll try our best to like be able to help you guys. If you need more credits and stuff like that. Okay. But please do not spend an exorbitant amount of money. I'm making it very clear here. This is your explicit warning. This stuff as is, this code will cost you money. Okay, it will at least bleed into your API credits. Okay. Okay. With that warning said, right? Okay, so we're using this model, the Llama 3.1 model, 8 billion instruct, right? There's a whole, we'll go over like where to get this model ID. I know this is like, oh, how did you even know this is the model ID, right? But I'll walk through that later. And we're just going to get a completion, right? We're telling the LLM, right, the client that we've created up here, right? Clients, this stuff again through the documentation. It's basically we want to use the chat function. We want the model to like complete our chat. And we're going to create a new instance of this with the model being this model that we want. And our message is kind of this in this format. Again, it's not clear why this is the case. And this is where, again, you would look at the documentation. You'd ask, how do I ask llama a question using together, and you would just copy paste the codes. That's literally what I did. Okay, so I'm going to run this. Okay, it's generating a response. Okay, it's done generating a response. Okay, so that's the check mark, right? Now I have the completion as this variable here, right? And that's it. That's literally the equivalent of copy pasting this question into ChatGPT and pressing enter and seeing the response that streams out, right? That's literally what we've done here with code. Okay. Now, obviously, just I've stored it here, but I'd like to actually see what it looks like. So this is some example boilerplate code to be able to print out the language model's response. So you can see here, okay, we've asked it a question and now it's giving us a response. It's saying it's suggestive of a UTI. I don't exactly remember what the actual question was, but hypothetically, this is hopefully a good response. Okay. So again, you can imagine there's a lot of cool things you can do with this, but this is like just the basics to kind of start, right? And yeah, we include some helpful links here that I definitely recommend you guys check out. Okay. So that's kind of the end of the tutorial. Okay, so kind of to walk through again, right? We walked through kind of like package management, right, for Python, and simple data structures like dictionaries, lists, function definition, things like that, right? We looked over how do we actually load the data sets, right? And in this case, we use this load dataset function from datasets, right, to be able to load tables of data with inputs and maybe expected outputs, right? And we showed how we can load these questions, we can ask these questions to models like Llama 3.1 to be able to, get potential responses out. And we can do things and analyze these responses and stuff like that. Okay. Some frequently asked questions just to kind of close off, right? So we've obviously talked about language models here and how to use it. Do you need to use language models? Absolutely not. You can use whatever technologies you want, right? Keep in mind that the theme is, I guess, like responsible generative AI, right? So hopefully you would use some sort of like generative AI tool, but it's purposely broad, right? For those of you who have experience, right? Generative diffusion models, GANs, vision models, truly whatever model you want to use, you're more than welcome to do that. I think LLMs would probably be most relevant for people, given that everything here is like kind of like text data, right? But truly, you can explore whatever you want. Okay. Do you need to use Python? So the answer here, we said no here, right? But it's a little bit more. So Python is good because it's easy to pick up, and all of ML is really written in this, right? And it's easy for other people to reproduce because everyone already uses Python for AI. Okay. If you have a explicit reason that you want to not use Python, please ask us beforehand. Okay. In general, this is like a soft no. Like we really want people to use Python here, but let's say you want to show a new technique to be able to do LLM inference at like 100 times speed up, and you want to use like a C or C++ for that, right? If that's the case, okay, please talk to us first, and then we'll work with you to make sure that happens. But in general, please try and use Python. Okay. The last question is, okay, what LLMs can you actually use for this, right? We said ChatGPT and Anthropic Claude, all of those are off limits, right? But what can you actually use? So these model IDs, right, for Together AI, the full list is available here. So if I click on this link, right, all of the model IDs, right, these are the ones here, right? So you can see we use the 8 billion instruct turbo, right? And there are other options here as well. So the ones explicitly from Together that are allowed, that satisfy the two criteria that they're open source and they are less than 8 billion parameters, are shown here. Okay, this table here, and I'd highly encourage you guys to use this as reference. Okay, all of the code always looks like this, but what you change is the model ID, which is shown here. Okay, each different company, generally speaking, has their own model. Okay, their own flagship model. I think Llama is usually a good starting point. It's kind of considered state of the art. So 3.2 and 3.1 are both solid choices. You can see their size is a little bit different. Gemma is also great. Mistral, I, I feel like Llama is a little bit better, but you can more than welcome to try this one out. I'm not as familiar with these, right? But there are also like this 7 billion parameter, and this is also 7 billion. So these are the ones you can try. There are other ones obviously also available with like other servers other than Together AI. But I think this is a good starting point. Okay, as long as you satisfy the less than or equal to 8 billion parameters and open source, truly you can use whatever you want. Again, if you're not using LLMs and you're using something like Vision or something, like get in touch with us beforehand, just because we want to make sure it's kind of like fair for everyone to be able to use. Okay. Other questions? Do you have to use Together AI? No, you can use AWS. You can run locally. You can do whatever you want. In our experience, Together AI is the cheapest, easiest to use, easy to get set up. So that's kind of what we recommend. But again, feel free to use whatever inference strategy you want. Okay. This is obviously a whirlwind tour and non-exhaustive for Python. Other helpful resources as well. And again, if you have questions, you're unsure of how to debug something, that's literally the whole point of this datathon. Please ask questions, DM us, ask anonymously, ask friends and other participants, whatever you want. Okay. And then the final question, not really related to this, right, is can you use GenAI to write your write up or ask it for project ideas or whatever, right? Absolutely. Okay. The whole like we hope that you guys get some like actual experience that you can take away from this, right? And one part is, being able to intelligently use Gen AI for everyday life stuff as well, right? So obviously there's a huge component of, you know, being able to write code to interface with LLMs and stuff like that, right? But if you want to use ChatGPT, right, to be able to help you analyze data or think of project ideas or spitball back and forth or whatever, you're more than welcome to do that, right? The one caveat though is that you and your team are responsible for whatever outputs they generate, right? If the Gen AI model inadvertently tells you a strategy to blow up humanity, right, or something, that's on you. Okay, so make sure you proofread, make sure the ideas make sense to you, right? Make sure you can understand and reproduce your own findings, right? You can't just feed your data into ChatGPT and say, okay, cool, now I'm done, right? So just be smart with how you use it. Again, if you're not sure how this policy works or whatever, please just get in touch with us. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. If you guys have any feedback or want to see specific things or again have follow-up questions, please just feel free to let me know. Thanks. Hope this was helpful.